Okay, it is right on time. Settling in after day's work. Got my book, got my coffee. We are ready to settle in and have a good night. So then, welcome back today to our what session is this? Our seventh reading from the Mysterious Island. Last time they had finished their little ship, they were able to navigate to the nearby Tabor Island, and thereupon they found a castaway from another wreck, or somehow or other, some person there. Um, but they'd been stranded long enough and alone long enough that they'd lost their mind, um, reverted to unintelligible, just their animal instinct. But they were able to bring them back, and they are now all returned and reunited on Lincoln Island. And we'll see whether they're able to coax their newfound compatriot back to civilization, um, whether they'll be able to find their own way out, and just in general, how things are going to start developing. There's lots about the island so far that is left unknown. What's in the well down below? What is prompting Jupe and Top to react so around the well? How did the supply drop randomly show up that was perfect for them? Why is everything just so conveniently ready and just so well set up for them on the island? There's very little chance that this is all just happenstance. So we'll find out more. We're a little bit more than halfway through the book at this point. So let's go ahead and just dig right into it. and we'll see if we can unravel some of the mystery of this island. So now we'll return with Chapter 16. Yes, the unfortunate man had wept! Some recollection, doubtless, had flashed across his brain, and to use Cyrus Harding's expression, by those tears he was once more a man. The colonists left him for some time on the plateau, and withdrew themselves to a short distance, so that he might feel himself free. But he did not think of profiting by this liberty, and Harding soon brought him back to Granite House. 2 days after this occurrence, the stranger appeared to wish gradually to mingle with their common life. He evidently heard and understood, but no less evidently was he strangely determined not to speak to the colonists. For one evening, Pencroft, listening at the door of his room, heard these words escape from his lips. "No, here, never!" The sailor reported these words to his companions. "There is some painful mystery there," said Harding. The stranger had begun to use the laboring tools, and he worked in the garden. When he stopped in his work, as was often the case, he remained retired within himself, but on the engineer's recommendation they respected the reserve which he apparently wished to keep. If one of the settlers approached him, he drew back, and his chest heaved with sobs, as if overburdened. Was it remorse that overwhelmed him thus? They were compelled to believe so, and Gideon Spilett could not help one day making this observation. If he does not wish to speak, it is because he has, I fear, things too serious to be told. They must be patient and wait. A few days later, on the 3rd of November, the stranger, working on the plateau, had stopped, letting his spade drop to the ground, and Harding, who was observing him from a little distance, saw that tears were again flowing from his eyes. A sort of irresistible pity led him towards the unfortunate man, and he touched his arm lightly. "My friend," said he. The stranger tried to avoid his look, and Cyrus Harding, having endeavored to take his hand, he drew back quickly. "My friend," said Harding in a firmer voice, "look at me. I wish it." The stranger looked at the engineer, and seemed to be under his power, as a subject under the influence of a mesmerist. He wished to run away, but then his countenance suddenly underwent a transformation. His eyes flashed. Words struggled to escape from his lips. He could no longer contain himself. At last he folded his arms. Then, in a hollow voice, "Who are you?" he asked Cyrus Harding. "Castaways, like you," replied the engineer, whose emotion was deep. "We have brought you here, among your fellow men." "My fellow men? I have none." "You are in the midst of friends." "Friends? For me?" "Friends!" exclaimed the stranger, hiding his face in his hands. "No, never! Leave me! Leave me!" Then he rushed to the side of the plateau which overlooked the sea, and remained there a long time motionless. Harding rejoined his companions, and related to them what had just happened. "Yes, there is some mystery in that man's life," said Gideon Spilett, "and it appears as if we had only re-entered society by the path of remorse." "I don't know what sort of man we have brought here," said the sailor. "He has secrets." "Which we will respect," interrupted Cyrus Harding quickly. "If he has committed any crime, he has most fearfully expiated it, and in our eyes he is absolved." For 2 hours the stranger remained alone on the shore, evidently under the influence of recollections which recalled all his past life, a melancholy life doubtless, and the colonists, without losing sight of him, did not attempt to disturb his solitude. However, after 2 hours, appearing to have formed a resolution, he came to find Cyrus Harding. His eyes were red with the tears he had shed, but he wept no longer. His countenance expressed deep humility. He appeared anxious, timorous, ashamed, and his eyes were constantly fixed on the ground. "Sir," said he to Harding, "your companions and you, are you English?" "No," answered the engineer, "we are Americans." "Ah!" said the stranger, and he murmured, "I prefer that." "And you, my friend?" asked the engineer. "English," he replied hastily. And as if these few words had been difficult to say, he retreated to the beach, where he walked up and down between the cascade and the mouth of the Mersey, in a state of extreme agitation. Then, passing one moment close to Herbert, he stopped, and in a stifled voice, "What month?" he asked. "December," replied Herbert. "What year?" 1866. 12 years! 12 years! He exclaimed, and then he left him abruptly. Herbert reported to the colonists the questions and answers which had been made. "This unfortunate man," observed Gideon Spilett, "was no longer acquainted with either months or years." "Yes," added Herbert, and he has been 12 years already on the islet when we found him there. 12 years, rejoined Harding. Ah, 12 years of solitude, after a wicked life, perhaps, may well impair a man's reason. I am induced to think, said Pencroft, that this man was not wrecked on Tabor Island, but that, in consequence of some crime, he was left there. You must be right, Pencroft, replied the reporter, and if it is so, it is not impossible that those who left him on the island may return to fetch him some day. And they will no longer find him, said Herbert. But then, added Pencroft, they must return, and, my friends, said Cyrus Harding, do not let us discuss this question until we know more about it. I believe that the unhappy man has suffered, that he has severely expiated his faults, whatever they may have been, and that the wish to unburden himself stifles him. Do not let us press him to tell us his history. He will tell it to us doubtless, and when we know it, we shall see what course it will be best to follow. He alone, besides, can tell us, if he has more than a hope, a certainty, of returning some day to his country. But I doubt it. And why? Asked the reporter. Because that, in the event of his being sure of being delivered at a certain time, he would have waited the hour of his deliverance, and would not have thrown this document into the sea. No, it is more probable that he was condemned to die on that islet, and that he never expected to see his fellow creatures again. But, observed the sailor, there is one thing which I cannot explain. What is it? If this man had been left for 12 years on Tabor Island, one may well suppose that he had been several years already in the wild state in which we found him. That is probable, replied Cyrus Harding. It must then be many years since he wrote that document. No doubt, and yet the document appears to have been freshly written. Besides, how do you know that the little bottle which enclosed the document may not have taken several years to come from Tabor Island to Lincoln Island? That is not absolutely impossible, replied the reporter. Might it not have been a long time already on the coast of the island? No, answered Pencroft, for it was still floating. We could not even suppose that after it had stayed for any length of time on the shore, it would have been swept off by the sea, for the south coast is all rocks, and it would certainly have been smashed to pieces there. That is true, rejoined Cyrus Harding thoughtfully. And then, continued the sailor, if the document was several years old, if it had been shut up in that bottle for several years, it would have been injured by damp. Now, there is nothing of the kind, and it was found in a perfect state of preservation. The sailor's reasoning was very just, and pointed out an incomprehensible fact, for the document appeared to have been recently written, when the colonists found it in the bottle. Moreover, it gave the latitude and longitude of Tabor Island correctly, which implied that its author had a more complete knowledge of hydrography than could be expected of a common sailor. There is in this, again, something unaccountable, said the engineer, but we will not urge our companion to speak. When he likes, my friends, then we shall be ready to hear him. During the following days, the engineer did not speak a word, the stranger did not speak a word, and did not once leave the precincts of the plateau. He worked away, without losing a moment, without taking a minute's rest, but always in a retired place. At mealtimes he never came to Granite House, although invited several times to do so, but contented himself with eating a few raw vegetables. At nightfall he did not return to the room assigned to him, but remained under some clump of trees, or, when the weather was bad, crouched in some cleft of the rocks. Thus he lived in the same manner as when he had no other shelter than the forests of Tabor Island, and as all persuasion to induce him to improve his life was in vain, the colonists waited patiently, and the time was near, when, as it seemed, almost involuntarily urged by his conscience, a terrible confession escaped him. On the 10th of November, around 8 o'clock in the evening, as night was coming on, the stranger appeared unexpectedly before the settlers, who were assembled under the veranda. His eyes burned strangely, and he had quite resumed the wild aspect of his worst days. Cyrus Harding and his companions were astounded on seeing that, overcome by some terrible emotion, his teeth chattered like those of a person in a fever. What was the matter with him? Was the sight of his fellow creatures insupportable to him? Was he weary of his return to a civilized mode of existence? Was he pining for his former savage life? It appeared so, as soon as he was heard to express himself in these incoherent sentences. Why am I here? By what right have you dragged me from my islet? Do you think there could be any tie between you and me? Do you know who I am, what I have done, why I was there, alone? And who told you that I was not abandoned there, that I was not condemned to die there? Do you know my past? How do you know that I have not stolen, murdered, that I am not a wretch, an accursed being, only fit to live like a wild beast, far from all... Speak, do you know it? The colonist listened, without interrupting the miserable creature, from whom these broken confessions escaped. As it were, in spite of himself, Harding, wishing to calm him, approached him, but he hastily drew back. No, no, he exclaimed. One word only. Am I free? You are free, answered the engineer. Farewell, then, he cried, and fled like a madman. Neb, Pencroft, and Herbert ran also towards the edge of the wood, but they returned alone. We must let him alone, said Cyrus Harding. He will never come back, exclaimed Pencroft. He will come back, replied the engineer. Many days passed, but Harding, was it a sort of presentiment, persisted in the fixed idea that sooner or later the unhappy man would return. It is the last revolt of his wild nature, said he, which remorse has touched, and which renewed solitude will terrify. In the meanwhile, works of all sorts were continued, as well on Prospect Heights as at the corral, where Harding intended to build a farm. It is unnecessary to say that the seeds collected by Herbert on Tabor Island had been carefully sown. The plateau thus formed one immense kitchen garden, well laid out and carefully tended, so that the arms of the settlers were never in want of work. There was always something to be done. As the esculents increased in number, it became necessary to enlarge the simple beds, which threatened to grow into regular fields and replace the meadows. But grass abounded in other parts of the island, and there was no fear of the onagers being obliged to go on short allowance. It was well worth while, besides, to turn Prospect Heights into a kitchen garden, defended by its deep belt of creeks, and to remove them to the meadows, which had no need of protection against the depredations of quadrumana and quadrupeds. On the 15th of November, the third harvest was gathered in. How wonderfully had the field increased in extent since 18 months ago, when the first grain of wheat was sown. The second crop, of 600,000 grains, produced, this time, 4,000 bushels, or 500 millions of grains. The colony was rich in corn, for 10 bushels alone were sufficient for sowing every year to produce an ample crop for the food both of men and beasts. The harvest was completed, and the last fortnight of the month of November was devoted to the work of converting it into food for man. In fact, they had corn, but not flour, and the establishment of a mill was necessary. Cyrus Harding could have utilized the second fall which flowed into the Mersey to establish his motive power, the first being already occupied with moving the felting mill, but after some consultation, it was decided that a simple windmill should be built on Prospect Heights. The building of this presented no more difficulty than the building of the former, and it was moreover certain that there would be no want of wind on the plateau, exposed as it was to the sea breezes. Not to mention, said Pencroft, that the windmill will be more lively and will have a good effect in the landscape. They set to work by choosing timber for the frame and machinery of the mill. Some large stones, found at the north of the lake, could easily be transformed into millstones, and as to the sails, the inexhaustible case of the balloon furnished the necessary material. Cyrus Harding made his model, and the site of the mill was chosen a little to the right of the poultry yard, near the shore of the lake. The frame was to rest on a pivot, supported with strong timbers, so that it could turn with all the machinery it contained as the wind required it. The work advanced rapidly. Neb and Pencroft had become very skillful carpenters, and had nothing to do but to copy the models provided by the engineer. Soon a sort of cylindrical box, in shape like a pepper pot, with a pointed roof, rose on the spot chosen. The 4 frames, which formed the sails, had been firmly fixed in the center beam, so as to form a certain angle with it, and secured with iron clamps. As to the different parts of the internal mechanism, the box destined to contain the 2 millstones, the fixed stone and the moving stone, the hopper, a sort of large trough, wide at the top, narrow at the bottom, which would allow the grain to fall on the stones, the oscillating spout intended to regulate the passing of the grain, and lastly the bolting machine, which, by the operation of sifting, separates the bran from the flour, were made without difficulty. The tools were good, and the work was not difficult. For in reality, the machinery of a mill is very simple. This was only a question of time. Everyone had worked at the construction of the mill, and on the 1st of December it was finished. As usual, Pencroft was delighted with his work, and had no doubt that the apparatus was perfect. "Now for a good wind," said he, "and we shall grind our first harvest splendidly." "A good wind, certainly," answered the engineer, "but not too much, Pencroft." "Pooh! Our mill would only go the faster." "There is no need for it to go so very fast," replied Cyrus Harding. "It is known by experience that the greatest quantity of work is performed by a mill when the number of turns made by the sails in a minute is 6 times the number of feet traversed by the wind in a second. A moderate breeze, which passes over 24 feet to the second, will give 16 turns to the sails during a minute, and there is no need of more." "Exactly!" cried Herbert. "A fine breeze is blowing from the northeast, which will soon do our business for us." There was no reason for delaying the inauguration of the mill, for the settlers were eager to taste the first piece of bread in Lincoln Island. On this morning 2 or 3 bushels of wheat were ground, and the next day, at breakfast, a magnificent loaf, a little heavy, perhaps, although raised with yeast, appeared on the table at Granite House. Everyone munched away at it with a pleasure which may easily be understood. In the meanwhile, the stranger had not reappeared. Several times Gideon Spilett and Herbert searched the forest in the neighborhood of Granite House, without meeting or finding any trace of him. They became seriously uneasy at this prolonged absence. Certainly, the former savage of Tabor Island could not be perplexed how to live in the forest, abounding in game, but was it not to be feared that he had resumed his habits, and that this freedom would revive in him his wild instincts? However, Harding, by a sort of presentiment, doubtless, always persisted in saying that the fugitive would return. "Yes, he will return," he repeated with a confidence which his companions could not share. When this unfortunate man was on Tabor Island, he knew himself to be alone. Here he knows that fellow men are awaiting him. Since he has partially spoken of his past life, the poor penitent will return to tell the whole, and from that day he will belong to us. The event justified Cyrus Harding's predictions. On the 3rd of December, Herbert had left the plateau to go and fish on the southern bank of the lake. He was unarmed, and till then had never taken any precautions for defense, as dangerous animals had not shown themselves on that part of the island. Meanwhile, Pencroft and Neb were working in the poultry yard, while Harding and the reporter were occupied at the chimneys in making soda, the store of soap being exhausted. Suddenly, cries resounded. "Help! Help!" Cyrus Harding and the reporter, being at too great a distance, had not been able to hear the shouts. Pencroft and Neb, leaving the poultry yard in all haste, rushed towards the lake. But before then, the stranger, whose presence at this lake no one had suspected, crossed Creek Glycerin, which separated the plateau from the forest, and bounded up the opposite bank. Herbert was there, face to face with a fierce jaguar, similar to the one which had been killed on Reptile End. Suddenly surprised, he was standing with his back against a tree, while the animal, gathering itself together, was about to spring. But the stranger, with no other weapon than a knife, rushed on the formidable animal, who turned to meet this new adversary. The struggle was short. The stranger possessed immense strength and activity. He seized the jaguar's throat with one powerful hand, holding it as if in a vice, without heeding the beast's claws which tore his flesh, and with the other he plunged his knife into its heart. The jaguar fell. The stranger kicked away the body, and was about to fly at the moment when the settlers arrived on the field of battle. But Herbert, clinging to him, cried, "No, no, you shall not go!" Harding advanced towards the stranger, who frowned when he saw him approaching. The blood flowed from his shoulder under his torn shirt, but he took no notice of it. "My friend," said Cyrus Harding, we have just contracted a debt of gratitude to you. To save our boy, you have risked your life." "My life!" murmured the stranger. "What is that worth? Less than nothing." "You are wounded. It is no matter. Will you give me your hand?" And as Herbert endeavored to seize the hand which had just saved him, the stranger folded his arms. His chest heaved, his look darkened, and he appeared to wish to escape. But making a violent effort over himself, and in an abrupt tone, "Who are you?" he asked, "and what do you claim to be to me?" It was the colonist's history which he thus demanded, and for the first time, perhaps this history recounted, he would tell his own tale. In a few words, Harding related all that had happened since their departure from Richmond, how they had managed, and what resources they now had at their disposal. The stranger listened with extreme attention. Then the engineer told who they all were: Gideon Spilett, Herbert, Pencroft, Neb, himself, and, he added, that the greatest happiness they had felt since their arrival at Lincoln Island was on the return of the vessel from Tabor Island, when they had been able to include among them a new companion. At these words, the stranger's face flushed. His head sunk on his breast, and confusion was depicted on his countenance. "And now that you know us," added Cyrus Harding, "will you give us your hand?" "No," replied the stranger in a hoarse voice. "No, you are honest men, and I..." That's the end of chapter 16. So their castaway has a history. It's may soon come to light. He's found himself somewhat, and he's decided that he does not deserve to be saved, it seems. But we'll see if they're able to coax him out, or to hear more of his story, and what will come of it. Is it some dark and terrible past, or is he over-exaggerating his own misadventures? We'll find out before long, I'm sure. So we'll carry on now with chapter 17. These last words justified the colonist's presentiment. There had been some mournful past, perhaps expiated in the sight of men, but from which his conscience had not yet absolved him. At any rate, the guilty man felt remorse. He repented, and his new friends would have cordially pressed the hand which they sought, but he did not feel himself worthy to extend it to honest men. However, after the scene with the jaguar, he did not return to the forest, and from that day did not go beyond the enclosure of Granite House. What was the mystery of his life? Would the stranger one day speak of it? Time alone could show. At any rate, it was agreed that his secret should never be asked from him, and that they would live with him as if they suspected nothing. For some days, their life continued as before. Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett worked together, sometimes chemists, sometimes experimentalists. The reporter never left the engineer except to hunt with Herbert, for it would not have been prudent to allow the lad to ramble alone in the forest, and it was very necessary to be on their guard. As to Neb and Pencroft, one day at the stables and poultry yard, another at the corral, without reckoning working in Granite House, they were never in want of employment. The stranger worked alone, and he had resumed his usual life, never appearing at meals, sleeping under the trees in the plateau, never mingling with his companions. It really seemed as if the society of those who had saved him was insupportable to him. "But then," observed Pencroft, "why did he entreat the help of his fellow creatures? Why did he throw that paper into the sea?" "He will tell us why, invariably," replied Cyrus Harding. "When? Perhaps sooner than you think, Pencroft." And indeed, the day of confession was near. On the 10th of December, a week after his return to Granite House, Harding saw the stranger approaching, who, in a calm voice and humble tone, said to him, "Sir, I have a request to make of you." "Speak," answered the engineer, "but first let me ask you a question." At these words, the stranger reddened, and he was on the point of withdrawing. Cyrus Harding understood what was passing in the mind of the guilty man, who doubtless feared that the engineer would interrogate him on his past life. Harding held him back. "Comrade," said he, "we are not only your companions, but your friends. I wish you to believe that, and now I will listen to you." The stranger pressed his hand over his eyes. He was seized with a sort of trembling, and remained a few moments without being able to articulate a word. "Sir," said he at last, "I have come to beg you to grant me a favor." "What is it?" "You have, 4 or 5 miles from here, a corral for your domesticated animals. These animals need to be taken care of. Will you allow me to live there with them?" Cyrus Harding gazed at the unfortunate man for a few moments, with a feeling of deep commiseration. Then, "My friend," said he, "the corral has only stables hardly fit for animals." "It will be good enough for me, sir." "My friend," answered Harding, "we will not constrain you in anything. You wish to live at the corral, so be it. You will, however, be always welcome at Granite House. But since you wish to live at the corral, we will make the necessary arrangements for you to being comfortably established there." "Never mind that. I shall do very well." "My friend," answered Harding, who always intentionally made use of this cordial appellation, "you must let us judge what it will be best to do in this respect." "Thank you, sir," replied the stranger as he withdrew. The engineer then made known to his companions the proposal which had been made to him, and it was agreed that they should build a wooden house at the corral, which they would make as comfortable as possible. That very day the colonists repaired to the corral with the necessary tools, and a week had not passed before the house was ready to receive its tenant. It was built about 20 feet from the sheds, and from there it was easy to overlook the flock of sheep, which then numbered more than 80. Some furniture, a bed, table, bench, cupboard, and chest were manufactured, and a gun, ammunition, and tools were carried to the corral. The stranger, however, had seen nothing of his new dwelling, and he had allowed the settlers to work there without him, while he occupied himself on the plateau, wishing, doubtless, to put the finishing stroke to his work. Indeed, thanks to him, all the ground was dug up and ready to be sowed when the time came. It was on the 20th of December that all arrangements at the corral were completed. The engineer announced to the stranger that his dwelling was ready to receive him, and the latter replied that he would go and sleep there that very evening. On this evening, the colonists were gathered in the dining room of Granite House. It was then 8 o'clock, the hour at which their companion was to leave them, not wishing to trouble him by their presence, and thus imposing on him the necessity of saying farewells which might perhaps be painful to him. They had left him alone and ascended to Granite House. Now, they had been talking in the room for a few minutes, when a light knock was heard at the door. Almost immediately, the stranger entered, and without any preamble, "Gentlemen," said he, "before I leave you, it is right that you should know my history, and I will tell it to you." These simple words profoundly impressed Cyrus Harding and his companions. The engineer rose. "We ask you nothing, my friend," said he. "It is your right to be silent." "It is my duty to speak." "Sit down, then." "No, I will stand." "We are ready to hear you," replied Harding. The stranger remained, standing in a corner of the room, a little in the shade. He was bareheaded, his arms folded across his chest, and it was in this posture that in a hoarse voice, speaking like one who obliges himself to speak, he gave the following recital, which his auditors did not once interrupt. On the 20th of December, 1854, a steam yacht, belonging to a Scotch nobleman, Lord Glenarvan, anchored off Cape Bernouilli, on the western coast of Australia, in the 37th parallel. On board this yacht were Lord Glenarvan and his wife, a major in the English army, a French geographer, a young girl, and a young boy. The last two were the children of Captain Grant, whose ship, the Britannia, had been lost, crew and cargo. A year before, the Duncan was commanded by Captain John Mangles, and manned by a crew of 15 men. This is the reason the yacht at this time lay off the coast of Australia. 6 months before, a bottle enclosing a document written in English, German, and French had been found in the Irish Sea, and picked up by the Duncan. This document stated in substance that there still existed 3 survivors from the wreck of the Britannia, that these survivors were Captain Grant and 2 of his men, that they had found refuge on some land of which the document gave the latitude, but of which the longitude, effaced by the sea, was no longer legible. The latitude was 37 degrees 11 minutes south. Therefore, the longitude being unknown, if they followed the 37th parallel over the continents and seas, they would be certain to reach the spot inhabited by Captain Grant and his 2 companions. The English Admiralty, having hesitated to undertake the search, Lord Glenarvan resolved to attempt everything to find the captain. He communicated with Mary and Robert Grant, who joined him. The Duncan yacht was equipped for the distant voyage, in which the nobleman's family and the captain's children wished to take part, and the Duncan, leaving Glasgow, proceeded towards the Atlantic, passed through the Straits of Magellan, and ascended the Pacific as far as Patagonia, where, according to a previous interpretation of the document, they supposed that Captain Grant was a prisoner among the Indians. The Duncan disembarked her passengers on the western coast of Patagonia, and sailed to pick them up again on the eastern coast at Cape Corrientes. Lord Glenarvan traversed Patagonia, following the 37th parallel, and having found no trace of the captain, he re-embarked on the 13th of November, so as to pursue his search through the ocean. After having unsuccessfully visited the islands of Tristan d'Acunha and Amsterdam, situated in her course, the Duncan, as I have said, arrived at Cape Bernouilli, on the Australian coast on the 20th of December, 1854. It was Lord Glenarvan's intention to traverse Australia as he had traversed America, and he disembarked. A few miles from the coast was established a farm belonging to an Irishman, who offered hospitality to the travelers. Lord Glenarvan was made known to the Irishman the cause which had brought him to these parts, and asked if he knew whether a three-masted English vessel, the Britannia, had been lost less than 2 years before on the west coast of Australia. The Irishman had never heard of this wreck, but to the great surprise of the bystanders, one of his servants came forward and said, "My lord, praise and thank God. If Captain Grant is still living, he is living on the Australian shores." "Who are you?" asked Lord Glenarvan. "A Scotchman, like yourself, my lord," replied the man. "I am one of Captain Grant's crew, one of the castaways of the Britannia." This man was called Ayrton. He was, in fact, the boatswain's mate of the Britannia, as his papers showed, but separated from Captain Grant at the moment when the ship struck upon the rocks. He had till then believed that the captain with all his crew had perished, and that he, Ayrton, was the sole survivor of the Britannia. Only, he added, it was not on the west coast, but on the east coast of Australia that the vessel was lost, and if Captain Grant is still living, as his document indicates, he is a prisoner among the natives, and it is on the other coast that he must be looked for. This man spoke in a frank voice, and with a confident look. His words could not be doubted. The Irishman, in whose service he had been for more than a year, answered for his trustworthiness. Lord Glenarvan, therefore, believed in the fidelity of this man, and by his advice resolved to cross Australia, following the 37th parallel. Lord Glenarvan, his wife, the 2 children, the Major, the Frenchman, Captain Mangles, and a few sailors, composed the little band under the command of Ayrton, while the Duncan, under charge of the mate Tom Austin, proceeded to Melbourne, there to await Lord Glenarvan's instructions. They set out on the 23rd of December, 1854. It is time to say that Ayrton was a traitor. He was, indeed, the boatswain's mate of the Britannia, but after some dispute with his captain, he endeavored to incite the crew to mutiny and seize the ship, and Captain Grant had landed him on the 8th of April, 1852, on the west coast of Australia, and then sailed, leaving him there, as was only just. Therefore, this wretched man knew nothing of the wreck of the Britannia. He had just heard it from Glenarvan's account. Since his abandonment, he had become, under the name of Ben Joyce, the leader of the escaped convicts, and if he boldly maintained that the wreck had taken place on the east coast, and led Lord Glenarvan to proceed in that direction, it was that he hoped to separate him from his ship, seize the Duncan, and make the yacht a pirate in the Pacific. Here the stranger stopped for a moment. His voice trembled, but he continued. The expedition set out, and proceeded across Australia. It was inevitably unfortunate, since Ayrton, or Ben Joyce, as he may be called, guided it, sometimes followed by his band of convicts, who had been told what they had to do. Meanwhile, the Duncan had been sent to Melbourne for repairs. It was necessary, then, to get Lord Glenarvan in order her to leave Melbourne and go to the east coast of Australia, where it would be easy to seize her. After having led the expedition near enough to the coast, in the midst of the vast forests with no resources, Ayrton obtained a letter, which he was charged to carry to the mate of the Duncan, a letter which ordered the yacht to repair immediately to the east coast, to Twofold Bay, that is to say, a few days' journey from the place where the expedition had stopped. It was there that Ayrton had agreed to meet his accomplices, and 2 days after gaining possession of the letter, he arrived at Melbourne. So far, the villain had succeeded in his wicked design. He would be able to take the Duncan into Twofold Bay, where it would be easy for the convicts to seize her, and her crew massacred. Ben Joyce would become master of the seas. That was Simba. He's learned to climb up on the desk, and is very, very vocal. Where were we? Let's see. So far, the villain had succeeded in his wicked design. He would be able to take the Duncan into Twofold Bay, where it would be easy for the convicts to seize her, and her crew massacred. Ben Joyce would become master of the seas, but it pleased God to prevent the accomplishments of these terrible projects. Ayrton arrived at Melbourne, delivered the letter to the mate, Tom Austin, who read it and immediately set sail. But judge of Ayrton's rage and disappointment when the next day he found that the mate was taking the vessel not to the east coast of Australia, to Twofold Bay, but to the east coast of New Zealand. He wished to stop him, but Austin showed him the letter, and indeed, by a providential error of the French geographer who had written the letter, the east coast of New Zealand was mentioned as the place of destination. All Ayrton's plans were frustrated. He became outrageous. They put him in irons. He was taken to the coast of New Zealand, not knowing what would become of his accomplices, or what would become of Lord Glenarvan. The Duncan cruised about on this coast until the 3rd of March. On that day, Ayrton heard the report of guns. The guns on the Duncan were being fired, and soon Lord Glenarvan and his companions came on board. This is what had happened. After 1,000 hardships, 1,000 dangers, Lord Glenarvan had accomplished his journey, and arrived on the east coast of Australia, at Twofold Bay. "No, Duncan!" he telegraphed to Melbourne. They answered. Duncan sailed on the 18th instant, destination unknown. Lord Glenarvan could only arrive at one conclusion, that his honest yacht had fallen into the hands of Ben Joyce, and had become a pirate vessel. However, Lord Glenarvan would not give up. He was a bold and generous man. He embarked in a merchant vessel, sailed to the west coast of New Zealand, traversed it along the 37th parallel, without finding any trace of Captain Grant. But on the other side, to his great surprise, and by the will of heaven, he found the Duncan, under command of the mate, who had been waiting for him for 5 weeks. This was on the 33rd of March, or the 3rd of March, wow. This was on the 3rd of March, 1855. Lord Glenarvan was now on board the Duncan, but Ayrton was there also. He appeared before the nobleman, who wished to extract from him all that the villain knew about Captain Grant. Ayrton refused to speak. Lord Glenarvan then told him that at the first port they put into, he would be delivered up to the English authorities. Ayrton remained mute. The Duncan continued her voyage along the 37th parallel. In the meanwhile, Lady Glenarvan undertook to vanquish the resistance of the ruffian. At last, her influence prevailed, and Ayrton, in exchange for what he would tell, proposed that Lord Glenarvan should leave him on some island in the Pacific, instead of giving him up to the English authorities. Lord Glenarvan, resolving to do anything to obtain information about Captain Grant, consented. Ayrton then related all his life, and it was certain that he knew nothing from the day on which Captain Grant had landed him on the Australian coast. Nevertheless, Lord Glenarvan kept the promise which he had given. The Duncan continued her voyage and arrived at Tabor Island. It was there that Ayrton was to be landed. It was there also that, by a veritable miracle, they found Captain Grant and 2 men, exactly on the 37th parallel. The convict, then, went to take their place on this desert islet. And at the moment he left the yacht, these words were pronounced by Lord Glenarvan. "Here, Ayrton, you will be far from any land, and without any possible communication with your fellow creatures. You cannot escape from this islet on which the Duncan leaves you. You will be alone, under the eye of a God who reads the depths of the heart, but you will be neither lost nor forgotten, as was Captain Grant. Unworthy as you are to be remembered by men, men will remember you. I know where you are, Ayrton, and I know where to find you. I will never forget it." And the Duncan, making sail, soon disappeared. This was the 18th of March, 1855. This is an aside, it seems. The events, which have just been briefly related, are taken from a work which some of our readers have no doubt read, and which is entitled Captain Grant's Children. They will remark on this occasion, as well as later, some discrepancy in the dates, but later again, they will understand why the real dates were not at first given. That's the end of the author's note there. Actually, kind of an interesting aside there. I've not read that either. Anyway, Ayrton was alone, but he had no want of either ammunition, weapons, tools, or seeds. At his, the convict's, disposal was the house built by honest Captain Grant, who had only to live and expiate in solitude the crimes which he had committed. Gentlemen, he repented. He repented. He was ashamed of his crimes, and was very miserable. He said to himself that if men came some day to take him from that islet, he must be worthy to return among them. How he suffered, that wretched man! How he labored to recover himself by work! How he prayed to be reformed by prayer! For 2 years, 3 years this went on, but Ayrton, humbled by solitude, always looking for some ship to appear on the horizon, asking himself if the time of expiation would soon be complete. Suffered as none other suffered. Oh, how dreadful was this solitude, to a heart tormented by remorse. But doubtless, heaven had not sufficiently punished this unhappy man, for he felt that he was gradually becoming a savage. He felt that brutishness was gradually gaining on him. He could not say if it was after 2 or 3 years of solitude, but at last he became the miserable creature you found. I have no need to tell you, gentlemen, that Ayrton, Ben Joyce, and I are the same. Cyrus Harding and his companions rose at the end of this account. It is impossible to say how much they were moved, what misery, grief, and despair lay revealed before them. Ayrton, said Harding, rising, you have been a great criminal, but heaven must certainly think that you have expiated your crimes, that you have proved, by your having been brought again among your fellow creatures, Ayrton, you are forgiven. And now you will be our companion? Ayrton drew back. Here is my hand, said the engineer. Ayrton grasped the hand which Harding extended to him, and great tears fell from his eyes. Will you live with us? Asked Cyrus Harding. Captain Harding, leave me some time longer, replied Ayrton. Leave me alone in the hut, in the corral. As you like, Ayrton, answered Cyrus Harding. Ayrton was going to withdraw when the engineer addressed one more question to him. One word more, my friend. Since it was your intention to live alone, why did you throw into the sea the document which put us on your track? A document? Repeated Ayrton, who did not appear to know what he meant. Yes, the document which we found enclosed in a bottle, giving us the exact position of Tabor Island. Ayrton passed his hand over his brow. Then, after having thought, I never threw any document into the sea, he answered. Never? Exclaimed Pencroft. Never. And Ayrton, bowing, reached the door and departed. That brings us to the end of chapter 17. So the great backstory of the castaway is shown. He was a former mutineer, stranded on Australia. Then, after having twisted the story of how he was left there to take advantage of this visiting, wandering Scottish lord to take advantage of his goodwill and try and hijack his ship, he was again stranded, this time on Tabor Island, where our castaways found him. But he wasn't the one that sent the message in a bottle that seemed oh so very fresh. So it is very hard to tell exactly where that came from, how they were brought to be made aware of him. Bottle ex machina indeed. And we'll take, not going to take a break, but I think it is time that I try and rig up a quick image for Mr. Simba. Because he's made his presence known a couple times already. I'm just gonna pull up the one that I used for Zoe and scale it down, but I'll make a proper one for Simba before too long. Let's see, here we go. That is default size. Let's pull Zoe up to see. He's actually even smaller than that. Baby boy is very, very tiny. There we go. That'll work for now. And I'll work up a Stream Deck button for him later, but for now, he's just going to hang out. That'll work for us for now, and we'll be able to get right back to it. So that brings us to Chapter 18. Poor man, said Herbert, who was rushed to the door, but returned, having seen Ayrton slide down the rope on the lift and disappear in the darkness. He will come back, said Cyrus Harding. Now, come now, Captain, exclaimed Pencroft. What does that mean? What? Buddy. What? Wasn't it Ayrton who threw that bottle into the sea? Who was it then? Certainly, if never a question was necessary to be made, it was that one. It was he, answered Neb, only the unhappy man was half mad. Yes, said Herbert, and he was no longer conscious of what he was doing. It can only be explained in that way, my friends, replied Harding quickly, and I understand now how Ayrton was able to point out exactly the situation of Tabor Island, since the events which had preceded his being left on the island had made it known to him. However, observed Pencroft, if he was not yet a brute when he wrote that document, and if he threw it into the sea 7 or 8 years ago, how is it that the paper has not been injured by the damp? That proves, answered Cyrus Harding, that Ayrton was deprived of intelligence at a more recent time than he thinks. Of course, it must be so, replied Pencroft. Without that, the fact would be unaccountable. Unaccountable indeed, answered the engineer, who did not appear desirous to prolong the conversation. But has Ayrton told the truth? Asked the sailor. Yes, replied the reporter. The story which he has told is true in every point. I remember quite well the account in the newspapers of the yacht expedition undertaken by Lord Glenarvan, and its result. Ayrton has told the truth, added Harding. Do not doubt it, Pencroft, for it was painful to him. People tell the truth when they accuse themselves like that. The next day, the 21st of December, the colonists descended to the beach. Having climbed the plateau, they found nothing of Ayrton. He had reached his house in the corral during the night, and the settlers judged it best not to agitate him by their presence. Time would doubtless perform what sympathy had been unable to accomplish. Herbert, Pencroft, and Neb resumed their ordinary occupations. On this day, the same work brought Harding and the reporter to the workshop at the Chimneys. Do you know, my dear Cyrus, said Gideon Spilett, that the explanation you gave yesterday on the subject of the bottle has not satisfied me at all? And how can it be supposed that the unfortunate man was able to write that document and throw the bottle into the sea without having the slightest recollection of it? Nor was it he who threw it in, my dear Spilett. You think, then— I think nothing. I know nothing, interrupted Cyrus Harding. I am content to rank this incident among those which I have not been able to explain to this day. Indeed, Cyrus, said Spilett, these things are incredible. Your rescue, the case stranded on the sand, Top's adventure, and lastly, this bottle. Shall we never have the answer to these enigmas? Yes, replied the engineer quickly. Yes, even if I have to penetrate into the bowels of this island. Chance will perhaps give us the key to this mystery. Chance? Spilett! I do not believe in chance, any more than I believe in mysteries in this world. There is a reason for everything unaccountable, which has happened here, and that reason I shall discover. But in the meantime, we must work and observe. The month of January arrived. The year 1867 commenced. The summer occupations were assiduously continued, during the days which followed. Herbert and Spilett, having gone in the direction of the corral, ascertained that Ayrton had taken possession of the habitation which had been prepared for him. He busied himself with the numerous flock confided to his care, and spared his companions the trouble of coming every 2 or 3 days to visit the corral. Nevertheless, in order to not leave Ayrton in solitude for too long a time, the settlers often paid him a visit. It was not unimportant either, in consequence of some suspicions entertained by the engineer and Gideon Spilett that this part of the island should be subject to a surveillance of some sort, and that Ayrton, if any incident occurred unexpectedly, should not neglect to inform the inhabitants of Granite House of it. Nevertheless, it might happen that something would occur which it would be necessary to bring rapidly to the engineer's knowledge. Independently of facts bearing on the mystery of Lincoln Island, many others might happen, which would call for the prompt interference of the colonists, such as the sighting of a vessel, a wreck on the western coast, the possible arrival of pirates, etc. Therefore, Cyrus Harding resolved to put the corral in instantaneous communication with Granite House. It was on the 10th of January that he made known his project to his companions. "Why, how are you going to manage that, Captain?" asked Pencroft. Do you by chance happen to think of establishing a telegraph?" "Exactly so," answered the engineer. "Electric?" cried Herbert. "Electric," replied Cyrus Harding. We have all the necessary materials for making a battery, and the most difficult thing will be to stretch the wires. But by means of a draw plate, I think we shall manage it. Well, after that, returned the sailor, I shall never despair of seeing ourselves some day rolling along on a railway. They then set to work, beginning with the most difficult thing. For if they failed in that, it would be useless to manufacture the battery and other accessories. The iron of Lincoln Island, as has been said, was of excellent quality. Sorry, a little distracted here. I've got a cat on my shoulder. The iron of Lincoln Island, as has been said, was of excellent quality, and consequently was very fit for being drawn out. Harding commenced and now they're walking across the keyboard. Lordy. Alright. Harding commenced by manufacturing a draw plate, that is to say, a plate of steel, pierced with conical holes of different sizes, which would successively bring the wire to the wished-for tenacity. This piece of steel, after having been tempered, was fixed in as firm a way as possible on a solid framework planted in the ground, only a few feet from the great fall, the motive power of which the engineer intended to utilize. In fact, as the fulling mill was there, although not then in use, its beam moved with extreme power, would serve to stretch out the wire by rolling it round itself. It was a delicate operation, and required much care. The iron, prepared previously in long, thin rods, the ends of which were sharpened with the file, having been introduced into the largest hole of the draw plate, was drawn out by the beam, which wound it round itself, to a length of 25 or 30 feet, then unrolled, and the same operation was performed successively through the holes of a less size. Finally, the engineer obtained wires from 40 to 50 feet long, which could be easily fastened together and stretched over the distance of 5 miles, which separated the corral from the bounds of Granite House. It did not take more than a few days to perform this work, and indeed, as soon as the machine had been commenced, Cyrus Harding left his companions to follow the trade of wire drawers, and occupied himself with manufacturing his battery. It was necessary to obtain a battery with a constant current. It is known that the elements of modern batteries are generally composed of retort coal, zinc, and copper. Copper was absolutely wanting to the engineer, who, notwithstanding all his researches, had never been able to find any trace of it in Lincoln Island, and was therefore obliged to do without it. Retort coal, that is to say, the hard graphite which is found in the retorts of gas manufactories, after the coal has been dehydrogenized, could have been attained, but it would have been necessary to establish a special apparatus, involving great labor. As to zinc, it may be remembered that the case found at Flotsam Point was lined with this metal, which could not be better utilized than for this purpose. Cyrus Harding, after mature consideration, decided to manufacture a very simple battery, resembling as nearly as possible that invented by Becquerel in 1820, and in which zinc only is employed. The other substances, azotic acid and potash, were all at his disposal. The way in which the battery was composed was as follows, and the results were to be attained by the reaction of acid and potash on each other. A number of glass bottles were made and filled with azotic acid. The engineer corked them by means of a stopper, through which he passed a glass tube, bored at its lower extremity, and intended to be plunged into the acid by means of a clay stopper secured by a rag. Into this tube, through its upper extremity, he poured a solution of potash, previously obtained by burning and reducing to ashes various plants, and in this way the acid and potash could act on each other through the clay. Cyrus Harding then took 2 slips of zinc, one of which was plunged into azotic acid, the other into a solution of potash. A current was immediately produced, which was transmitted from the slip of zinc in the bottle to that in the tube, and the 2 slips having been connected by a metallic wire, the slip in the tube became the positive pole, and that in the bottle of the negative pole of the apparatus. Each bottle, therefore, produced as many currents as united would be sufficient to produce all the phenomena of the electric telegraph. Okay, yep, we're fine. Such was the ingenious and very simple apparatus constructed by Cyrus Harding, an apparatus which would allow them to establish a telegraphic communication between Granite House and the corral. On the 6th of February was commenced the planting along the road of the corral of posts furnished with glass insulators and intended to support the wires. A few days after, the wire was extended, ready to produce the electric current at a rate of 20,000 miles a second. 2 batteries had been manufactured, one for Granite House and the other for the corral, for it was necessary the corral should be able to communicate with Granite House. It might also be useful that Granite House should be able to communicate with the corral. As to the receiver and manipulator, they were very simple. As at the 2 stations, the wire was wound round a magnet, that is to say, round a piece of soft iron surrounded with a wire. The communication was thus established between the 2 poles. The current, starting from the positive pole, traversed the wire, passed through the magnet, which was temporarily magnetized, and returned through the earth to the negative pole. If the current was interrupted, the magnet immediately became unmagnetized. It was sufficient to place a plate of soft iron before the magnet, which attracted during the passage of the current, would fall back when the current was interrupted. This movement of the plate was thus obtained. Harding could easily fasten it to a needle arranged on a dial bearing the letters of the alphabet, and in this way communicate from one station to the other. All was completely arranged on the 12th of February. On this day, Harding, having sent the current through the wire, asked if all was going on well at the corral, and received, in a few moments, a satisfactory reply from Ayrton. Pencroft was wild with joy, and every morning and evening he sent a telegram to the corral, which always received an answer. This mode of communication presented 2 very real advantages. Firstly, because it enabled them to ascertain that Ayrton was at the corral, and secondly, that he was thus not left completely isolated. Besides, Cyrus Harding never allowed a week to pass without going to see him, and Ayrton came from time to time to Granite House, where he always found a cordial welcome. The fine season passed away in the midst of the usual work. The resources of the colony, particularly in vegetables and corn, increased from day to day, and the plants brought from Tabor Island had succeeded perfectly. The plateau of Prospect Heights presented an encouraging aspect. The 4th harvest had been admirable, and it may be supposed that no one thought of counting whether the 400,000 millions of grains duly appeared in the crop. However, Pencroft had thought of doing so, but Cyrus Harding, having told him that even if he managed to count 300 grains a minute, or 9,000 an hour, it would take him nearly 5,500 years to finish his task. The honest sailor considered it best to give up the idea. The weather was splendid, the temperature very warm in the daytime, but in the evening the sea breezes tempered the heat of the atmosphere and procured cool nights for the inhabitants of Granite House. There were, however, a few storms, which, although they were not of long duration, swept over Lincoln Island with extraordinary fury. The lightning blazed, and the thunder continued to roll for some hours. At this period, the little colony was extremely prosperous. The tenants of the poultry yard swarmed, and they lived on the surplus, and it became necessary to reduce the population to a more moderate number. The pigs had already produced young, and it may be understood that their care for these animals absorbed a great part of Neb and Pencroft's time. The onagers, who had 2 pretty colts, were most often mounted by Gideon Spilett and Herbert, who had become an excellent rider, under the reporter's instruction, and they also harnessed them to the cart, either for carrying wood and coal to Granite House, or different mineral productions required by the engineer. Several expeditions were made about this time into the depths of the far west forests. The explorers could venture there without having anything to fear from the heat, for the sun's rays scarcely penetrated through the thick foliage spreading above their heads. They thus visited all the left bank of the Mersey, along which ran the road from the corral to the mouth of Falls River. But in these excursions the settlers took care to be well armed, for they met with savage wild boars, with which they often had a tussle. They also, during this season, made fierce war against the jaguars. Gideon Spilett had vowed a special hatred against them, and his pupil Herbert seconded him well. Armed as they were, they no longer feared to meet one of those beasts. Herbert's courage was superb, and the reporter's sang-froid astonishing. Already, 20 magnificent skins ornamented the dining room of Granite House, and if this continued, the jaguar race would soon be extinct in the island, the object aimed at by the hunters. The engineer sometimes took part in the expeditions made to the unknown parts of the island, which he surveyed with great attention. It was for the other traces than those of animals that he searched the thickets of the vast forest, but nothing suspicious ever appeared. Neither Top nor Jupe, who accompanied him, ever betrayed by their behavior that there was anything strange there. And yet, more than once the dog barked at the mouth of the well, which the engineer had before explored without result. At this time, Gideon Spilett, aided by Herbert, took several views of the most picturesque parts of the island, by means of the photographic apparatus found in the cases, and of which they had not yet made any use. This apparatus, provided with a powerful object glass, was very complete. Substances necessary for the photographic reproduction, collodion for preparing the glass plate, nitrate of silver to render it sensitive, hyposulfate of soda to fix the prints obtained, chloride of ammonium in which to soak the paper destined to give the positive proof, acetate of soda and chloride of gold in which to immerse the paper, nothing was wanting. Even the papers were there, all prepared, before laying in the printing frame upon the negatives. It was sufficient to soak them for a few minutes in the solution of nitrate of silver. The reporter and his assistant became in a short time very skillful operators, and they obtained the fine views of the country, such as the island, taken from Prospect Heights, with Mount Franklin in the distance, the mouth of the Mersey, so picturesquely framed in the high rocks, the glade and the corral, with the spurs of the mountain in the background, the curious development of Claw Cape, Flotsam Point, etc. Nor did the photographers forget to take the portraits of the inhabitants of the island, leaving out no one. "It multiplies us," said Pencroft. And the sailor was enchanted to see his own countenance, faithfully reproduced, ornamenting the walls of Granite House, and he stopped as willingly before this expedition as he would have done before the richest shop windows in Broadway. But it must be acknowledged that the most successful portrait was incontestably that of Master Jupe. Master Jupe had sat with a gravity not to be described, and his portrait was lifelike. "He looks as if he was going to grin," exclaimed Pencroft. And if Master Jupe had not been satisfied, he would have been very difficult to please, but he was quite content, and contemplated his own countenance with a sentimental air which expressed some small amount of conceit. The summer heat ended with the month of March. The weather was sometimes rainy, but still warm. The month of March, which corresponds to the September of northern latitudes, was not so fine as might have been hoped. Perhaps it announced an early and rigorous winter. It might have been supposed, one morning, the 21st, that the first snow had already made its appearance. In fact, Herbert, looking early from one of the windows of Granite House, exclaimed, "Hello! The island is covered with snow!" "Snow, at this time," answered the reporter, joining the boy. Their companions were soon beside them, but could only ascertain one thing, that not only the islet, but all the beach below Granite House was covered with one uniform sheet of white. "It must be snow," said Pencroft. "Or rather, it's very like it," replied Neb. "But the thermometer marks 58 degrees, observed Gideon Spilett. Cyrus Harding gazed at the sheet of white without saying anything, for he really did not know how to explain this phenomenon, at this time of year and in such a temperature. "By Jove!" exclaimed Pencroft, "all our plants will be frozen!" And the sailor was about to descend, when he was preceded by the nimble Jupe, who slid down to the sand. But the orang had not touched the ground when the snowy sheet arose and dispersed in the air in such innumerable flakes that the light of the sun was obscured for some minutes. They were indeed swarms of seabirds, with dazzling white plumage. They had perched by the thousands on the islet and on the shore, and they disappeared in the distance, leaving the colonists amazed, as if they had been present at some transformation scene, in which summer succeeded winter at the touch of a fairy's wand. Unfortunately, the change had been so sudden that neither the reporter nor the lad had been able to bring down one of those birds, of which they could not recognize the species. A few days after came the 26th of March, the day on which, 2 years before, the castaways from the air had been thrown upon Lincoln Island. That brings us to the end of chapter 18. we're about an hour in, so I'm going to take a few minutes, refresh my drink, and see if I can track down the cats. They're kind of wandering about here and there. So I'll be back in just a moment, and we'll resume in a bit. Thanks, guys. Okay, let's get settled back in. Let's update here. Alright. Have you guys had this before? The strawberries and cream Dr. Pepper? It is pretty fantastic. Alright. Yeah, it's one of my favorite discoveries. It's quite good, really. They've got it in 0 as well, so do recommend. Alright, so let's go ahead and pick right back up where we left off, because there's been quite a lot happening. I've got a BlackBerry one in the garage waiting to come up for its turn. I've heard they're kind of mid, but it would be a miss not to give it a try at least. Alright, so, Chapter 19. 2 years already, and for 2 years the colonists had had no communication with their fellow creatures. They were without news from the civilized world, lost on this island, as completely as if they had been on the most minute star of the celestial hemisphere. What was now happening in their country? The picture of their native land was always before their eyes, the land torn by civil war at the time they left it, and which the Southern Rebellion was perhaps still staining the blood. It was a great sorrow to them, and they often talked together of these things, without ever doubting, however, that the cause of the North must triumph, for the honor of the American Confederation. During these 2 years, not a vessel had passed in sight of the island, or at least not a sail had been seen. It was evident that Lincoln Island was out of the usual track, and also that it was unknown, as was besides proved by the maps, for though there was no port, vessels might have visited it for the purpose of renewing their store of water. But the surrounding ocean was deserted as far as the eye could reach, and the colonists must rely on themselves for regaining their native land. However, one chance of rescue existed, and this chance was discussed one day on the first week of April when the colonists were gathered together in the dining room of Granite House. They had been talking of America, of their native country, which they had so little hope of ever seeing again. Decidedly, we have only one way, said Spilett, one single way for leaving Lincoln Island, and that is to build a vessel large enough to sail several hundred miles. It appears to me that when one has built a boat, it is just as easy to build a ship, and in which we might go to Pomotos, added Herbert, just as easily as we went to Tabor Island. I do not say no, replied Pencroft, who had always the casting vote in maritime questions. I do not say no, although it is not exactly the same thing to make a long as a short voyage. If our little craft had been caught in any heavy gale of wind during the voyage to Tabor Island, we should have known that land was at no great distance either way. But 1,200 miles is a pretty long way, and the nearest land is at least twice that distance. Or is at least that distance. Where did I get twice? Would you not, in that case, Pencroft, attempt the adventure? Asked the reporter. I will attempt anything that is desired, Mr. Spilett, answered the sailor, and you know well that I am not a man to flinch. Remember, besides, that we number another sailor amongst us now, remarked Neb. Who is that? Ayrton. If he will consent to come, said Pencroft. Nonsense, returned the reporter. Do you think that if Lord Glenarvan's yacht had appeared at Tabor Island while he was still living there, Ayrton would have refused to depart? You forget, my friends, then said Cyrus Harding, that Ayrton was not in possession of his reason during the last years of his stay there. But that is not the question. The point is to know if we may count among our chances of being rescued the return of the Scotch vessel. Now, Lord Glenarvan had promised Ayrton that he would return to take him off of Tabor Island when he considered that his crimes were expiated. And I believe that he will return. Yes, said the reporter, and I will add that he will return soon, for it is 12 years since Ayrton was abandoned. Well, answered Pencroft, I agree with you that the nobleman will return, and soon too. But where will he touch? At Tabor Island, and not at Lincoln Island. That is the more certain, replied Herbert, as Lincoln Island is not even marked on the map. Therefore, my friends, said the engineer, we ought to take the necessary precautions for making our presence and that of Ayrton on Lincoln Island known at Tabor Island. Certainly, answered the reporter, and nothing is easier than to place in the hut, which was Captain Grant's and Ayrton's dwelling, a notice which Lord Glenarvan and his crew cannot help finding. given the position of our island. "It is a pity," remarked the sailor, "that we forgot to take that precaution on our first visit to Tabor Island." "And why should we have done it?" asked Herbert. "At that time we did not know Ayrton's history, and we did not know that anyone was likely to come some day to fetch him. And when we did know his history, the season was too advanced to allow us to return then to Tabor Island." "Yes," replied Harding, "it was too late, and we must put off the voyage until next spring." "But suppose the Scotch yacht comes before that?" said Pencroft. "That is not probable," replied the engineer, "for Lord Glenarvan would not choose the winter season to venture into these seas. Either he has already returned to Tabor Island, since Ayrton has been with us, that is to say, during the last 5 months, and has left again, or he will not come till later, and it will be time enough in the first fine October days to go to Tabor Island, and leave a notice there." "We must allow," said Neb, "that it will be very unfortunate if the Duncan has returned to these parts only a few months ago." "I hope that it is not so," replied Cyrus Harding, "and that Heaven has not deprived us of the best chance which remains to us." "I think," observed the reporter, "that at any rate we shall know what we have to depend on when we have been to Tabor Island, for if the yacht has returned there, we will necessarily have left some traces of their visit." "That is evident," answered the engineer. "So then, my friends, since we have this chance of returning to our country, we must wait patiently, and if it is taken from us, we shall see what it will be best to do." "At any rate," remarked Pencroft, "it is well understood that if we do leave Lincoln Island, it will not be because we were uncomfortable there." "No, Pencroft," replied the engineer, "it will be because we are far from all that a man holds dearest in the world, his family, his friends, his native land." Matters being thus decided, the building of a vessel large enough to sail either to the archipelagos in the north or to New Zealand in the west was no longer talked of, and they busied themselves in their accustomed occupations, with a view to wintering a third time in Granite House. However, it was agreed that before the stormy weather came on, their little vessel should be employed in making a voyage round the island. A complete survey of the coast had not yet been made, and the colonists had but an imperfect idea of the shore to the west and the north. From the mouth of Falls River to the Mandible Capes, as well as the narrow bay between them, which opened like a shark's jaws. The plan of this excursion was proposed by Pencroft, and Cyrus Harding fully acquiesced in it, for he himself wished to see this part of his domain. The weather was variable, but the barometer did not fluctuate by sudden movements, and they could therefore count on tolerable weather. However, during the first week of April, after a sudden barometrical fall, a renewed rise was marked by a heavy gale of wind, lasting 5 or 6 days. Then the needle of the instrument remained stationary, at a height of 29 inches and 9/10, and the weather appeared propitious for an excursion. The departure was fixed for the 16th of April, and the Bonadventure, anchored in Port Balloon, was provisioned for a voyage which might be of some duration. Cyrus Harding informed Ayrton of the projected expedition, and proposed that he should take part in it, but Ayrton preferred to remain on shore. It was decided that he should come to Granite House during the absence of his companions. Master Jup was ordered to keep him company, and made no remonstrance. On the morning of the 16th of April, all the colonists, including Top, embarked. A fine breeze blew from the southwest, and the Bonadventure tacked on leaving Port Balloon so as to reach Reptile End. Of the 90 miles which the perimeter of the island measured, 20 included the south coast, between the port and the promontory, the wind being right ahead, as it was necessary to hug the shore. It took the whole day to reach the promontory, for the vessel on leaving port had only 2 hours of ebb tide, and had therefore to make way for 6 hours against the flood. It was nightfall before the promontory was doubled. The sailor then proposed to the engineer that they should continue sailing slowly with 2 reefs in the sail, but Harding preferred to anchor a few cable lengths from the shore, so as to survey that part of the coast during the day. It was agreed, also, that as they were anxious for a minute exploration of the coast, they should not sail during the night, but would always, when the weather permitted it, be at anchor near the shore. The night was passed under the promontory, and the wind having fallen, nothing disturbed the silence. The passengers, with the exception of the sailor, scarcely slept as well on board the Bonadventure as they would have done in their rooms at Granite House, but they did sleep, however. Pencroft set sail at break of day, and by going on the larboard tack, they could keep close to the shore. The colonists knew this beautiful wooded coast, since they had already explored it on foot, and yet it again excited their admiration. They coasted along as close in as possible, so as to notice everything, avoiding always the trunks of trees which floated here and there. Several times also they anchored, and Gideon Spilett took photographs of the superb scenery. About noon, the Bonadventure arrived at the mouth of Falls River. Beyond, on the left bank, a few scattered trees appeared, and 3 miles further even these dwindled into solitary groups among the western spurs of the mountain, whose arid ridge sloped down to the shore. What a contrast between the northern and southern part of the coast! In proportion as one was woody and fertile, so the other was rugged and barren. It might have been designated as one of those iron coasts, as they are called in some countries, and its wild confusion appeared to indicate that a sudden crystallization had been produced in the yet liquid basalt of some distant geological sea. These stupendous masses would have terrified the settlers if they had been cast at first on this part of the island. They had not been able to perceive the sinister aspect of the shore from the summit of Mount Franklin, for they overlooked it from too great a height. But viewed from the sea, it presented a wild appearance, which could not perhaps be equaled in any corner of the globe. The Bonadventure sailed along the coast for the distance of... YouTube, come on, there we go. The Bonadventure sailed along this coast for the distance of half a mile. It was easy to see that it was composed of blocks of all sizes, from 20 to 300 feet in height, and of all shapes, round like towers, prismatic like steeples, pyramidal like obelisks, conical like factory chimneys. An iceberg of the polar seas could not have been more capricious in its terrible sublimity. Here, bridges were thrown from one rock to another. There, arches like those of a wave, into the depths of which the eye could not penetrate. In one place, large vaulted excavations presented a monumental aspect. In another, a crowd of columns, spires, and arches, such as no Gothic cathedral ever possessed. Every caprice of nature, still more varied than those of the imagination, appeared on this grand coast, which extended over a length of 8 or 9 miles. Cyrus Harding and his companions gazed with a feeling of surprise bordering on stupefaction. But although they remained silent, Top, not being troubled with the feelings of this sort, uttered barks, which were repeated by the 1,000 echoes off the basaltic cliff. The engineer even observed that these barks had something strange in them, like those which the dog had uttered at the mouth of the well in Granite House. "Let us close in," said he, and the Bonadventure sailed as near as possible to the rocky shore. Perhaps some cave, which it would be advisable to explore, existed here. But Harding saw nothing, not a cavern, not a cleft which would serve as a retreat to any being whatever, for the foot of the cliff was washed by the surf. Soon Top's barks ceased, and the vessel continued her course at a few cables' length from the coast. In the northwest part of the island, the shore became again flat and sandy. A few trees here and there rose above a low, marshy ground, which the colonists had already surveyed, and in violent contrast to the other desert shore, life was again manifested by the presence of myriads of waterfowl. That evening, the Bonadventure anchored in a small bay to the north of the island, near the land, such was the depth of the water here. The night passed quietly, for the breeze died away with the last light of day, and only rose again with the first streaks of dawn. As it was easy to land, the usual hunters of the colony, that is to say, Herbert and Gideon Spilett, went for a ramble of 2 hours or so, and returned with several strings of wild duck and snipe. Top had done wonders, and not a bird had been lost, thanks to his zeal and cleverness. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the Bonadventure set sail, and ran rapidly towards North Mandible Cape, for the wind was right astern, and freshening rapidly. "However," observed Pencroft, "I should not be surprised if a gale came up from the west. Yesterday the sun set in a very red-looking horizon, and now, this morning, those mare's tails don't forebode anything good. These mare's tails are cirrus clouds, scattered in the zenith, their height from the sea being less than 5,000 feet. They look like light pieces of cotton wool, and their presence usually announces some sudden change in the weather. Well, said Harding, let us carry as much sail as possible and run for shelter into Shark Gulf. I think that the Bonadventure will be safe there. Perfectly, replied Pencroft. And besides, the north coast is merely sand, very uninteresting to look at. I shall not be sorry, resumed the engineer, to pass not only tonight, but tomorrow in that bay, which is worth being carefully explored. I think that we shall be obliged to do so, whether we like it or not, answered Pencroft, for the sky looks very threatening towards the west. Dirty weather is coming on. At any rate, we have a favorable wind for reaching Cape Mandible, observed the reporter. A very fine wind, replied the sailor, but we must tack to enter the Gulf, and I should like to see my way clear in these unknown waters. Quarters which appear to be filled with rocks, added Herbert, if we judge by what we saw on the south coast of Shark Gulf. Pencroft, said Cyrus Harding, do as you think best. We will leave it to you. Don't make your mind uneasy, Captain, replied the sailor. I shall not expose myself needlessly. I would rather a knife were run into my ribs than a sharp rock into those of my Bonadventure. That which Pencroft called ribs was the part of this vessel under water, and he valued it more than his own skin. What o'clock is it? Asked Pencroft. 10 o'clock, replied Gideon Spilett. And what distance is it to the Cape, Captain? About 15 miles, replied the engineer. That's a matter of 2 hours and a half, said the sailor, and we shall be off the Cape between 12 and 1 o'clock. Unluckily, the tide will be turning at that moment, and will be ebbing out of the Gulf. I am afraid that it will be very difficult to get in, having both wind and tide against us. And the more so that it is a full moon today, remarked Herbert, and these April tides are very strong. Well, Pencroft, asked Harding, can you not anchor off the Cape? Anchor near land, with the bad weather coming on, exclaimed the sailor. What are you thinking of, Captain? We should run aground of a certainty. What will you do then? I shall try to keep in the offing until the flood, that is to say, until about 7 in the evening, and if there is still light enough, I will try to enter the Gulf. If not, we must stand off and on during the night, and we will enter tomorrow at sunrise. As I told you, Pencroft, we will leave it to you, answered Harding. Ah, said Pencroft, if only there was a lighthouse on the coast. It would be much more convenient for sailors. Yes, replied Herbert, and this time we shall have no obliging engineer to light a fire to guide us into port. Why, indeed, my dear Cyrus, said Spilett, we never have thanked you. But frankly, without that fire, we should never have been able... A fire? Asked Harding, much astonished at the reporter's words. We mean, Captain, answered Pencroft, that on board the Bonadventure we were very anxious during the few hours before our return, and we should have passed on to windward of the island, if it had not been for the precaution you took of lighting a fire the night of the 19th of October on Prospect Heights. Yes, yes, that was a lucky idea of mine, replied the engineer. And this time, continued the sailor, unless the idea occurs to Ayrton, there will be no one of us to do that little service. No, no one, answered Cyrus Harding. A few minutes after, finding himself alone in the bows of the vessel with the reporter, the engineer bent down and whispered, If there is one thing certain in this world, Spilett, it is that I never lighted any fire during the night of the 19th of October, neither on Prospect Heights nor on any other part of the island. That is the end of chapter 19, but that is a bit of a drop, wouldn't you say? So they keep dropping hints and suggestions of someone else being on the island. There's all sorts of suggestions, but this is one of the more concrete showings that something is definitely going on. But there's no hints yet as to who or what it might be. I'm sure we'll find more later on, but things are starting to get a little... Yeah. Yep, smoke monster lighting the fires. Dropping off care packages. Yep. Jupe is just taking care of everything behind the scenes. He really just, best butler of all times. All right, well, let's just carry on. We've got another time. We've got time for another maybe 2 chapters at this rate. So maybe some of this mystery will unravel, or more will pile on, as seems more likely at this point. So, chapter 20. Things happened as Pencroft had predicted, he being seldom mistaken in his prognostications. The wind rose, and from a fresh breeze it soon increased to a regular gale. That is to say, it acquired a speed of from 40 to 45 miles an hour, before which a ship in the open sea would have run under close reefed topsails. Now, as it was nearly 6 o'clock when the Bonadventure reached the Gulf, and as at that moment the tide turned, it was impossible to enter. They were therefore compelled to stand off, for even if they had wished to do so, Pencroft could not have gained the mouth of the Mercy. Hoisting the jib to the mainmast by way of a storm sail, he hove to, putting the head of the vessel towards the land. Fortunately, although the wind was strong, the sea, being sheltered by the land, did not run very high. They had, then, little to fear from the waves, which always endanger small craft. The Bonadventure would doubtlessly not have capsized, for she was well ballasted, but enormous masses of water falling on the deck might injure her if her timbers could not sustain them. Pencroft, as a good sailor, was prepared for anything. Certainly, he had great confidence in his vessel, but nevertheless he awaited the return of day with some anxiety. During the night, Cyrus Harding and Gideon Spilett had no opportunity for talking together, and yet the words pronounced in the reporter's ear by the engineer were well worth being discussed, together with the mysterious influence which appeared to reign over Lincoln Island. Gideon Spilett did not cease from pondering over this new and inexplicable incident, the appearance of a fire on the coast of the island. The fire had actually been seen. His companions, Herbert and Pencroft, had seen it with him. The fire had served to signalize the position of the island during that dark night, and they had not doubted that it was lighted by the engineer's hand. And here was Cyrus Harding, expressly declaring that he had never done anything of the sort. Spilett resolved to recur to this incident as soon as the Bonadventure returned, and to urge Cyrus Harding to acquaint their companions with these strange facts. Perhaps it would be decided to make in common a complete investigation of every part of Lincoln Island. However that might be, on this evening no fire was lighted on these yet unknown shores, which formed the entrance to the Gulf, and the little vessel stood off during the night. When the first streaks of dawn appeared in the western horizon, the wind, which had slightly fallen, shifted 2 points, and enabled Pencroft to enter the narrow gulf with greater ease. Towards 7 o'clock in the morning, the Bonadventure, weathering the North Mandible Cape, entered the strait and glided on to the waters so strangely enclosed in the frame of lava. "Well," said Pencroft, "this bay would make admirable roads, in which a whole fleet could lie at their ease." "What is especially curious," observed Harding, "is that the gulf has been formed by 2 rivers of lava, thrown out by the volcano and accumulated by successive eruptions. The result is that the gulf is completely sheltered on all sides, and I believe that even in the stormiest weather, the sea here must be as calm as a lake." "No doubt," returned the sailor, "since the wind has only that narrow entrance between the 2 capes to get in by, and, besides, the North Cape protects that of the south in a way which would make the entrance of gusts very difficult. I declare, our Bonadventure could stay here from one end of the year to the other, without even digging at her anchor." "It is rather large for her," observed the reporter. "Well, Mr. Spilett," replied the sailor, "I agree that it is too large for the Bonadventure, but if the fleets of the Union were in want of a harbor in the Pacific, I don't think they would ever find a better place than this." "We are in the shark's mouth," remarked Neb, alluding to the form of the gulf. "Right into its mouth, my honest Neb," replied Herbert. "But you are not afraid that it will soon shut upon us, are you?" "No, Mr. Herbert," answered Neb, "and yet this gulf here doesn't please me much. It has a wicked look." "Hullo!" cried Pencroft. "Here is Neb, turning up his nose at my gulf, just as I was thinking of presenting it to America." "But, at any rate, is the water deep enough?" asked the engineer. "For a depth sufficient for the keel of the Bonadventure would not be enough for those of our ironclads." "That is easily found out," replied Pencroft. And the sailor sounded with a long cord which served him as a lead line, and to which was fastened a lump of iron. This cord measured nearly 50 fathoms, and its entire length was unrolled without finding any bottom. "There," exclaimed Pencroft, "our ironclads can come here after all. They would not run aground." "Indeed," said Gideon Spilett, "this gulf is a regular abyss, but taking into consideration the volcanic origin of the island, it is not astonishing that the sea should offer similar depressions." "One would say, too," observed Herbert, "that these cliffs were perfectly perpendicular, and I believe that at their foot, even with a line 5 or 6 times longer, Pencroft would not find bottom." "That is all very well," then said the reporter, "but I must point out to Pencroft that his harbor is wanting in one very important respect." "And what is that, Mr. Spilett?" "An opening, a cutting of some sort, to give access to the interior of the island. I do not see a spot on which we could land." And, in fact, the steep lava cliffs did not afford a single place suitable for landing. They formed an insuperable barrier, recalling, but with more wildness, the fjords of Norway. The Bonadventure, coasting as close as possible along the cliffs, did not discover even a projection which would allow the passengers to leave the deck. Pencroft consoled himself by saying that with the help of a mine they could soon open out the cliff when that was necessary, and then, as there was evidently nothing to be done in the gulf, he steered his vessel towards the strait and passed out at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. "Ah," said Neb, uttering a sigh of satisfaction. One might really say that the honest negro did not feel at his ease in those enormous jaws. The distance from Mandible Cape to the mouth of the Mercy was not more than 8 miles. The head of the Bonadventure was put towards Granite House, and a fair wind filling her sails, she ran rapidly along the coast. To the enormous lava rocks succeeded upon those capricious sand dunes, among which the engineer had been so singularly recovered, and which seabirds frequented in thousands. About 4 o'clock, Pencroft, leaving the point of the islet on his left, entered the channel which separated it from the coast, and at 5 o'clock the anchor of the Bonadventure was buried in the sand at the mouth of the Mercy. The colonists had been absent 3 days from their dwelling. Ayrton was waiting for them on the beach, and Jup came joyously to meet them, giving vent to deep grunts of satisfaction. A complete exploration of the coast of the island had now been made, and no suspicious appearances had been observed. If any mysterious being resided in it, it could only be under cover of the impenetrable forest of the Serpentine Peninsula, to which the colonists had not yet directed their investigations. Gideon Spilett discussed these things with the engineer, and it was agreed that they should direct the attention of their companions to the strange character of certain incidents which had occurred on the island, and of which the last was the most unaccountable. However, Harding, returning to the fact of a fire having been kindled on the shore by an unknown hand, could not refrain from repeating for the 20th time to the reporter, "But are you quite sure of having seen it? Was it not a partial eruption of the volcano, or perhaps some meteor?" "No, Cyrus," answered the reporter. "It was certainly a fire lighted by the hand of man. Besides, question Pencroft and Herbert. They saw it as I saw it myself, and they will confirm my words." In consequence, therefore, a few days after, on the 25th of April, in the evening, when the settlers were all collected on Prospect Heights, Cyrus Harding began by saying, "My friends, I think it is my duty to call your attention to certain incidents which have occurred in the island, on the subject of which I shall be happy to have your advice. These incidents are, so to speak, supernatural." "Supernatural!" exclaimed the sailor, emitting a volume of smoke from his mouth. "Can it be possible that our island is supernatural? No, Pencroft, but mysterious most certainly," replied the engineer, "unless you can explain that which Spilett and I have until now failed to understand." "Speak away, Captain," answered the sailor. "Well, have you understood," then said the engineer, "how it was that after falling into the sea I was found a quarter of a mile into the interior of the island, and that without my having any consciousness of my removal there?" "Unless, being unconscious," said Pencroft. "That is not admissible," replied the engineer. "But to continue, Have you understood? Have you understood how Top was able to discover your retreat 5 miles from the cave in which I was lying? The dog's instinct, observed Herbert. Singular instinct, returned the reporter, since notwithstanding the storm of rain and wind which was raging during the night, Top arrived at the Chimneys, dry and without a speck of mud. Let us continue, resumed the engineer. Have you understood how our dog was so strangely thrown up out of the water of the lake after his struggle with the dugong? No, I confess not at all, replied Pencroft, and the wound which the dugong had in its side, a wound which seemed to have been made with a sharp instrument, that can't be understood either. Let us continue again, said Harding. Have you understood, my friends, how that bullet got into the body of the young peccary, how that case happened to be so fortunately stranded, without there being any trace of a wreck? How that bottle containing the document presented itself so opportunely during our first sea excursion? How our canoe, having broken its moorings, floated down the current of the Mercy and rejoined us at the very moment we needed it? How, after the ape invasion, the latter was so obligingly thrown down from Granite House? And lastly, how the document, which Ayrton asserts was never written by him, fell into our hands? As Cyrus Harding thus enumerated, without forgetting one, the singular incidents which had occurred in the island, Herbert, Neb, and Pencroft stared at each other, not knowing what to reply, for this succession of incidents, grouped thus for the first time, could not but excite their surprise to the highest degree. Upon my word, said Pencroft at last, you are right, Captain, and it is difficult to explain all these things. Well, my friends, resumed the engineer, a last fact has just been added to these, and it is no less incomprehensible than the others. What is it, Captain? Asked Herbert quickly. When you were returning from Tabor Island, Pencroft, continued the engineer, you said that a fire appeared on Lincoln Island? Certainly, answered the sailor. And you are quite certain of having seen this fire? As sure as I see you now. You also, Herbert? Why, Captain, cried Herbert, that fire was blazing like a star of the first magnitude. But was it not a star? Urged the engineer. No, replied Pencroft, for the sky was covered with thick clouds, and at any rate, a star would not have been so low on the horizon. But Mr. Spilett saw it as well as we, and he will confirm our words. I will add, said the reporter, that the fire was very bright, and that it shot up like a sheet of lightning. Yes, exactly, added Herbert, and it was certainly placed on the heights of Granite House. Well, my friends, replied Cyrus Harding, during the night of the 19th of October, neither Neb nor I lighted any fire on the coast. You did not? Exclaimed Pencroft, in the height of his astonishment, not being able to finish his sentence. We did not leave Granite House, answered Cyrus Harding, and if a fire appeared on the coast, it was lighted by another hand than ours. Pencroft, Herbert, and Neb were stupefied. No illusion could be possible. And a fire had actually met their eyes during the night of the 19th of October. Yes, they had to acknowledge it. A mystery existed, an inexplicable influence, evidently favorable to the colonists, but very irritating to their curiosity, was executed always in the nick of time on Lincoln Island. Could there be some being hidden in its profoundest recesses? It was necessary at any cost to ascertain this. Harding also reminded his companions of the singular behavior of Top and Jup when they prowled round the mouth of the well, which placed Granite House in communication with the sea, and he told them that he had explored the well without discovering anything suspicious. The final resolve taken, in consequence of this conversation, by all the members of the colony, was that as soon as the fine season returned, they would thoroughly search the whole of the island. But from that day, Pencroft appeared to be anxious. He felt as if the island, which he had made it his own personal property, belonged to him entirely no longer, and that he shared it with another master, to whom, willing or not, he felt subject. Neb and he often talked of those unaccountable things, and both their natures inclining them to the marvelous, were not far from believing that Lincoln Island was under the dominion of some supernatural power. In the meanwhile, the bad weather came with the month of May. the November of the northern zones. It appeared that the winter would be severe and forward. The preparations for the winter season were therefore commenced without delay. Nevertheless, the colonists were well prepared to meet the winter, however hard it might be. They had plenty of felt clothing, and the Musmons, very numerous by this time, had furnished an abundance of wool necessary for the manufacture of this warm material. It is unnecessary to say that Ayrton had been provided with this comfortable clothing. Cyrus Harding proposed that he should come to spend the bad season with them, in Granite House, where he would be better lodged than at the corral, and Ayrton promised to do so, as soon as the last work at the corral was finished. He did this towards the middle of April. From that time Ayrton shared the common life, and made himself useful on all occasions. But still humble and sad, he never took part in the pleasures of his companions. For the greater part of this, the third winter which the settlers passed in Lincoln Island, they were confined to Granite House. There were many violent storms and frightful tempests, which appeared to shake the rocks to their very foundations. Immense waves threatened to overwhelm the island, and certainly any vessel anchored near the shore would have been dashed to pieces. Twice during one of these hurricanes, the Mercy swelled to such a degree as to give reason to fear that the bridges would be swept away, and it was necessary to strengthen those on the shore, which disappeared under the foaming waters, when the sea beat against the beach. It may well be supported that such storms, comparable to waterspouts, in which were mingled rain and snow, would cause great havoc on the plateau of Prospect Heights. The mill and the poultry yard particularly suffered. The colonists were often obliged to make immediate repairs, without which the safety of the birds would have been seriously threatened. During the worst weather, several jaguars and troops of quadrumana ventured to the edge of the plateau, and it was always to be feared that the most active and audacious would, urged by hunger, manage to cross the stream, which besides, when frozen, offered them an easy passage. Plantations and domestic animals would have been infallibly destroyed, without a constant watch, and it was often necessary to make use of the guns to keep those dangerous visitors at a respectful distance. Occupation was not wanting to the colonists, for without reckoning their outdoor cares, they had always 1,000 plans for the fitting up of Granite House. They had also some fine sporting excursions, which were made during the frost in the vast Tadorn Marsh. Gideon Spilett and Herbert, aided by Jup and Top, did not miss a shot in the midst of myriads of wild duck, snipe, teal, and others. The access to these hunting grounds was easy. Besides, whether they reached them by the road to Port Balloon, after having passed the Mercy Bridge, or by turning the rocks from Flotsam Point, the hunters were never distant from Granite House more than 2 or 3 miles. Thus passed the 4 winter months, which were really rigorous, that is to say, June, July, August, and September. But in short, Granite House did not suffer much from the inclemency of the weather, and it was the same with the corral, which, less exposed than the plateau, and sheltered partly by Mount Franklin, only received the remains of the hurricanes, already broken by the forests and high rocks of the shore. The damages there were consequently of small importance, and the activity and skill of Ayrton promptly repaired them, when sometime in October he returned to pass a few days in the corral. During this winter, no fresh, inexplicable incident occurred. Nothing strange happened, although Pencroft and Neb were on the watch for the most insignificant facts to which they attached any mysterious cause. Top and Jup themselves no longer growled round the well, or gave any signs of uneasiness. It appeared, therefore, as if the series of supernatural incidents was interrupted, although they often talked of them during the evenings in Granite House, and they remained thoroughly resolved that the island should be searched, even in those parts the most difficult to explore. But an event of the highest importance, and of which the consequences might be terrible, momentarily diverted from their projects Cyrus Harding and his companions. It was the month of October, and the fine season was swiftly returning. Nature was reviving, and among the evergreen foliage of the conifera which formed the border of the wood already appeared the young leaves of the bankseas, deodars, and other trees. It may be remembered that Gideon Spilett and Herbert had, at different times, taken photographic views of Lincoln Island. Now, on the 17th of this month of October, towards 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Herbert, enticed by the charms of the sky, thought of reproducing Union Bay, which was opposite to Prospect Heights, from Cape Mandible to Claw Cape. The horizon was beautifully clear, and the sea, undulating under a soft breeze, was as calm as the waters of a lake, sparkling here and there under the sun's rays. The apparatus had been placed at one of the windows of the dining room at Granite House, and consequently overlooked the shore and the bay. Herbert proceeded as he was accustomed to do, and the negative obtained. He went away to fix it by means of the chemicals deposited in a dark nook of Granite House. Returning to the bright light, and examining it well, Herbert perceived on his negative an almost imperceptible little spot on the sea horizon. He endeavored to make it disappear by reiterated washing, but could not accomplish it. It is a flaw in the glass, he thought. And then he had the curiosity to examine this flaw with a strong magnifier, which he unscrewed from one of the telescopes. But he had scarcely looked at it when he uttered a cry, and the glass almost fell from his hands. Immediately, running to the room in which Cyrus Harding was, he extended the negative and magnifier towards the engineer, pointing out the little spot. Harding examined it. Then, seizing his telescope, he rushed to the window. The telescope, after having slowly swept the horizon, at last stopped on the looked-for spot, and Cyrus Harding, lowering it, pronounced one word only: "A vessel!" And in fact, a vessel was in sight off Lincoln Island. And that brings us to the end of part 2 of The Mysterious Island. And I think that is about as good a cliffhanger as I could possibly leave us off with. Reasonably good timing, too. We're just shy of 2 hours tonight. So let's just kill some time here and discuss. They did say the thing. The name drop happened finally. They started talking about the mysteries of the island that until now only we'd really been talking about. So yeah, things are all of a sudden coming to a head. But we'll have to wait until next time to see what will come of this vessel. Will they be able to hail it? Will it come to the island? Will it be friendly? Is it pirates after all? Is it the Scotsman coming back? We won't know until maybe Friday. But yeah, so it's been a good session so far. We've had a few good ones. We've had some. The book started slowly, definitely. I think that's pretty common of Verne. The very beginning is full of action to pull you in, and then there's sort of a lull to catch you unawares. There's not a whole lot happening, but then a slow burn, little things piling up, and then as we're rounding the crest, things are really starting to take off now. Looking at it, we are at about 65% of the way through the book, so we're making good progress. There's still a lot of book left, but we're past the halfway point. Yeah, yeah. This is I don't know. Is this a book that's pretty commonly in curriculum for readings? I'm not sure. Aliens. But yeah, this is interesting so far. We're yeah, I don't think I've read Verne for school anywhere. It was mostly just for pleasure. I think it's probably just fantastic enough, but to be left out. But yeah, I think you're right. It very well could be. It's of a reasonably high level. The word choice and the complexities are right. There's maybe not enough symbolism and deconstruction to be made for what would usually be like a high school English class, but to really sort of get people interested, I could see it being chosen if it hadn't sometime passed. Yeah, Yeah, you're right. Oedipus Rex is. I remember reading Oedipus Rex in, shoot, I think it was 11th or 12th grade. So that was up there. But that is probably about enough for tonight. Thanks very much for being with us tonight. In this wrapping up of part two. We actually had some time to chat today, which was nice. Um, Usually it's go go go. I don't find much time to stop between the chapters, so we're starting to yap a little bit, and we'll see if this becomes more the norm, or maybe we'll just stick to the reading. It really will just depend on who's around and how talkative chat tends to be. Yeah, I don't know what's common in. I guess I should look up and see what the readings are these days. It may just be that certain things are being either pulled from or added to the curriculums, or just, it may just be more modern things that are trying to worm their way into the consciousness. There's nothing to say that it can't be that books read in class must be old. I remember reading Mouse for over summer one year. But all right, with that, let's go ahead and wrap it here. If I let myself go, keep going, it'll just keep on going. So, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I hope you've enjoyed this reading of The Mysterious Island. Our next session is planned for Friday, where we'll hopefully relieve some of the tension of this cliffhanger tonight. Alrighty, have a great night, guys, and see you again next time.